Our approach to climate really starts first and foremost with the acknowledgement that we are nowhere near on track. I mean, we're not on track for 1.5. We're not even on track for 2 degrees. 1.5 is actually physically impossible at this point, especially when we consider that the sulfur aerosol pollution from our fossil fuels is actually masking probably about a half a degree of warming that will be realized when we decarbonize. I mean, I like to say that we already basically live in a 2 degree world. We've just been masking a quarter of it with the dirtiest and most inequitable geoengineering experiment anyone could ever possibly devise.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmens, author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, and I'll be your host today. Here at the Climate Emergency Forum, we've been dedicated for a few years now to bringing you, the viewer, the broadest possible range of people and ideas needed to address the deepening climate emergency. We've been doing that for a while with several hundred programs, but today's program, I think, is one of the most exciting we've produced, and that's because our guest is Joshua Elliott. Joshua, you are the chief scientist at Renaissance Philanthropy, which is an organization that goes well beyond talk. You are identifying and funding some of the boldest, most promising ideas imaginable for helping to prevent and confront the climate crisis at its roots. What makes your work, I think, extra valuable is your remarkable background that you bring. You've spent nearly a decade, I understand, in academia doing computational climate economics, energy systems modeling. Then you went to the storied organization, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project in the United States, where you programmed hundreds of millions of dollars in R&D, building programs at the frontier of AI and science. You span climate, water, food security, synthetic biology, and even epidemiology. And now you're at Renaissance Philanthropy, where you're channeling all of that background into one of the most ambitious philanthropic science efforts on the planet. And one of your initiatives, I understand, that you and your colleagues have launched is something called the Advanced Research for Climate Emergencies, or ARC, a program designed to advance climate emergencies action from the Arctic, the Antarctic, to coral reefs and beyond. And as part of that program, you created what I understand is called the Climate Emergencies Forum in plural, focusing on, and I'm not sure if you created that because you believe there are multiple climate emergencies or whether you just didn't want to conflict with our name, but whatever the reason was, that brought a smile to my face when we saw that. So, and joining us as well today will be our regular panelist, Paul Beckwith. Paul, you're a climate systems scientist from Ottawa, Canada. You're a host of a widely followed YouTube program covering every dimension of the climate crisis. And as always, following our conversation with Joshua, I'll be presenting what we call the Climate three of the biggest climate stories of the week, each guaranteed to be in less than 1 minute. So please stay with us for that. And before we begin, if you value this program, please like it, subscribe to our channel, share your comments and questions, and definitely visit us at climateemergencyforum.org. Donations are always welcome and deeply, deeply appreciated. So, Joshua, I almost think of Renaissance, maybe a little presumptuously, as a sister organization, given how closely our names align. Of course, you have the funding, the resources, and the worldwide network of scientific intellect. We've got a platform here on YouTube to promote, evaluate, and help disseminate some of the ideas that you and others are generating and supporting. So that kind of feels like a little bit of a genuine synergy to me. So with that in mind, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you arrived here at this work, and why our viewers should be paying particularly close attention to what Renaissance Philanthropy is doing today.
Thank you so much, Herb. That was a fantastic introduction. You forgot to mention that my PhD is in theoretical high energy particle physics. I'm so far outside of my lane in so many different areas. What brought me here was this sort of long journey through the climate action community from where I started in 2008 at the University of Chicago, doing computational, environmental, economic modeling, and energy systems modeling. If you'll recall, 2008 was such an exciting and hopeful time, and Obama entering office with a massive majority in the House and Senate, and everybody thought, oh man, it's climate policy is just inevitable now. Now it's just about making sure that we design the optimal climate policy that will be, sustainable and maximize the value proposition into the future. And so we started developing a lot of economic modeling and things like that to try and explore some of the edge cases around that, like carbon leakage issues, like carbon offshoring, and how do we protect against those kinds of issues that are kind of the details of carbon policy, right? Well, then 2010 rolled around. That optimism collapsed quite rapidly. And so I did that for a couple more years before I thought, man, I should actually maybe move on to doing something useful. So started focusing on climate extremes, extreme drought and flood and et cetera. And then finally, as you mentioned, climate impacts in agriculture and hydrology and forestry and conflict and migration, all these different areas. That's really the first part of my trajectory from climate policy and thinking, oh, climate policy is possible to, oh, it's not. We need to start thinking about extremes and impacts and adaptation. And then from there, as you mentioned, I went to DARPA and had the chance to do a lot of amazing programs, increasingly became interested in this field of catastrophic climate risks, things like climate tipping points, but not exclusively things like climate tipping points. I was able to, on January 21st, 2021, I don't know if you know what happened on that day, I was able to actually launch my first program that had climate in the name. Before that, everything was extreme weather, but I launched a program on AI-assisted climate tipping point modeling that included a bunch of work on climate tipping points and also some of the first work that we had funded on exploring potential interventions that could slow or delay or
Mm.
prevent those tipping points from
But
occurring.
you mentioned that date in 2021. Why is that so significant?
That was the first date that Biden took office, and we were allowed to use the word climate again in the federal government.
At least for 4 more years, anyway, till now.
So really, I mean, that was really the beginning of my journey into this area. I quickly went down the rabbit hole of these sort of catastrophic Earth system risks. 10 or 15 years ago, I knew they existed, but they were thought to be vanishing low probability, if very, very high impact events. And I thought, well, there's more immediate things that I can spend my time on, like figuring out like the trends in sort of droughts and floods and things that are affecting people immediately. But by the time, this was whatever, 3, 4 years ago, that low probability was starting to look a lot less low of these sorts of events. And so combining that with understanding at that time how completely and totally neglected these things were, how completely and totally ignored they are in typical sort of in most of the IPCC and UNFCCC processes and things like that. And so I really started increasingly focusing my time on that. After DARPA, I did a stint at a big climate philanthropy based in London, where I launched the solar radiation management program there, designed and launched that strategy, which ended up, I think, being the biggest single investment in that field ever. And unfortunately, about 5 months into that, I discovered that having a 2-year-old in Brooklyn and a job in London was not actually the most scalable life model. So I left that one. But fortunately, just a few months after that, we started Renaissance Philanthropy. Renaissance works across like every possible vertical area of science and technology and policy. Our mission is simply to increase by multiple orders of magnitude, like philanthropic and government investment in science and technology in order to solve the problems and take advantage of the opportunities that we have in the future. So we have dozens and dozens of different programs in all sorts of different areas, from improving education to bringing down the cost of space telescopes by 3 orders of magnitude, you name it. My biggest passion, though, obviously, was still the climate. And so I've been building since that time 2 years ago when we launched, almost exactly 2 years ago, actually. We just celebrated our birthday last week. I've been spending a lot of my time building our climate portfolio. So that really started out with what I call our catastrophic risk and resilience portfolio, which is anchored, as you mentioned, by our ARC initiative, which is really, you can think of as basically like a nonprofit venture studio for like scoping, recruiting, and designing philanthropically funded, time-bound translational R&D programs that look at specific catastrophic risks within the climate system, and design stage-gated responsible research programs for trying to demonstrate whether and how there are methods and technologies by which we could reduce the probability of those risks, stabilize key systems, et cetera. Our approach to climate really starts first and foremost with the acknowledgement that like we are nowhere near on track. I mean, we're not on track for 1.5. We're not even on track for 2 degrees. 1.5 is actually physically impossible at this point, like especially when we consider that the sulfur aerosol pollution from our fossil fuels is actually masking probably about a half a degree of warming that will be realized when we decarbonize. I mean, I like to say that we already basically live in a 2 degree world. We've just been masking a quarter of it with like the dirtiest and most inequitable geoengineering experiment anyone could ever possibly devise. When you start from that premise, like what it means is like, well, we need to take big swings. We're no longer in like the linear part of climate action where we can sort of marginally increase our efforts and our funding in the existing categories and et cetera. We need to take really, really big swings. And we have a variety of programs still in what I call our frontier mitigation portfolio that are doing that. We're very bullish on the possibility of geologic hydrogen if it can accelerate fast enough. And if it turns out to be as plentiful as people think, it could end up significantly bending the curve of decarbonization, not solving the problem, but maybe being a big contribution. So we're making a big bet on that. We similarly think that the cement sector has a real opportunity with some sustained investment, largely in the adoption side of the pipeline, to like accelerate decarbonization for cement, and that it's a highly neglected opportunity. So we work in a bunch of different spaces where we see neglected opportunities, where we see complexity that other people are afraid to approach, and often, where we see things that other organizations neglect to do, perhaps because of the appearance of controversy or other such things. And that's obviously been the biggest thing I think that has prevented people from focusing on the field of catastrophic risk and climate interventions, is that perceived thing. So we think that's kind of like where we are really additive in this space, is that we go into a sector and we do systemic assessment. We say like, okay, here's, this is a really big, important, a big if true thing, as we like to say, and go into it. My biggest priority, certainly since we started, has been in catastrophic risk and resilience. The first program we helped to build and launch was the Arête Glacier Initiative, which is working on better modeling and understanding of ice sheets, so to better predict sea level rise, but also to figure out if there are things we can do, particularly like removing water or heat from the bed of the glaciers to try and stabilize ice sheets, especially places like Thwaites Glacier in the West Antarctic ice sheet, to prevent catastrophic sea level rise from happening. Yeah.
Just so you know, and I think regular viewers would know, we're not afraid in this group to talk about big ideas and controversial ideas. If I can speak for Paul, you've been a pioneer in promoting solar radiation management, what you're calling the three-legged bar stool, what I call the climate triad. We had the folks who were in charge of the seabed curtain project on Thwaites, including David Holland, the glaciologist, live from Antarctica earlier this year. So that's part of the reason why we wanted to chat with you, because you will find a very open audience for the biggest and boldest ideas, some of which are, inevitably will fail or may turn out to be different than we expect because we're just looking at them. We're totally in sync in terms of we can't avoid looking big and acting big and researching big. With that, speaking of big, I wanted to turn it over to Paul, who has always got big and important ideas for your conversation with Joshua.
Thanks, Herb, and thanks, Joshua, for coming on. Of course, the AMOC, I think, is the mother of all tipping points. And, recent peer-reviewed papers on that show that the risk is much higher than we thought before. The models aren't quite getting it right. It would change our planet. I mean, the northern hemisphere would go 7 degrees cooler. Antarctica would go 6 degrees warmer. There's lots of little signs that this is already starting. I mean, it's probably the slowest in 1,600 years, the AMOC. And there's signs that we're in trouble, say, even in a few decades. Stefan Ramsdorf, well, he's been looking at this for 35 years. I have a video channel, almost 2,000 videos, not quite, where I analyze scientific papers and I try to explain them in a way the public can understand. It's just Paul Beckwith. But recently I talked about some very exciting work. The ocean sequesters 26% of human emissions every year. So if we could just up that a little bit, that can go a long way to drawing down carbon. So how could we possibly do that? First of all, if the AMOC fails, that's going to be sequestering less carbon, right? But people don't realize where the carbon goes into the ocean. A lot of it is in the eddies, downwelling eddies. So you have eddies, you have the 5 western boundary currents, including Gulf Stream, Kuroshio Current, 3 in the southern hemisphere. And from these strong surface water movements, you get eddies spinning off on the order of 100 kilometers in diameter or so. And if the eddies are spinning clockwise in the northern hemisphere, you can use your right-hand rule. You get Ekman pumping. You get water movement downwards. Now, there's a lot of dissolved inorganic carbon in that water, and that moves downwards, and then it can be sequestered into the ocean. But what about just sprinkling the iron sulfate at the surface in those eddies and then generating phytoplankton blooms, and then those can also be sent downwards into the ocean. So there's some interesting studies recently that have looked a lot at this. And one thing I've noticed in the scientific literature, there's more and more papers coming from authors in non-US countries, lots of European papers, authors, lots of Chinese authors. They're researching a lot of these different things, and I'm seeing less and less papers from the US, unfortunately. Hopefully, this is just a glitch and will pass at some point. I'm very optimistic that we can actually draw down large amounts of CO2. And, talking about net zero isn't good enough, right? If we do net zero, then levels will still be too high in the atmosphere. We'll still have all of these extreme weather events, et cetera. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So, are you looking at carbon capture? Are you looking at iron fertilization of the ocean as one of your projects?
I've long been as well very bullish on multiple different approaches to iron fertilization. So early on in developing ARC, we were supporting some of the XOIS people, which I can't remember what it stands for, but it's the sort of broad community on the sort of traditional, if you can call it that, fertilization techniques, and continue to try to help to advance their objectives, and thinks that that is research that needs to be done. More recently, I've been working really closely with a group called Growing Oceans that's trying to scale up a different technique for iron fertilization that actually works in a different part of the ocean that is low nitrogen, low chlorophyll instead of high nitrogen, high chlorophyll. The iron that's fertilized actually stimulates the development of these organisms that actually fix nitrogen from the air into the water, which reduces some of the concerns with traditional iron fertilization, which is that you're really just moving nitrogen around. You're not actually increasing it in bulk. So I think that's a really promising approach. We're supporting them really closely as they move forward with their first generation of experiments and the work that they're doing. And then I've also been really interested in another approach, which is related to the eddy approach you're talking about. I don't think I've ever quite heard it specifically like framed in terms of putting iron into eddy locations. I don't know much about eddy locations, but there's a really interesting proposal by Mukul Sharma. He's done a lot of research on not actually trying to stimulate phytoplankton growth, but actually just like using iron-rich clay slurry to actually go to places where there's already phytoplankton blooms happen and just cause them to sink. Because right now you have large phytoplankton blooms that occur in many parts of the world, often in very, very predictable patterns. For example, off the coast of California, there's where it comes up and gets shallow. Deep nutrient-rich water comes up off the coast of California and then sort of hits the coast and flows back along the surface. And as it does that, a huge and consistent phytoplankton bloom occurs there, which then floats out to a pretty consistent spot. I forget what the distance is, not too far off the coast, where it sits on the surface, dies, and then respires all that CO2 back into the atmosphere. Geez, if we could just like somehow spray something on that, so if every one of those phytoplankton blooms would sink to the deep ocean instead of respiring back into the atmosphere, that would actually be a significant amount of additional carbon capture in the ocean. There's so many interesting proposals. I mean, obviously, ocean alkalinity enhancement. I can't agree with you more. Like, I think that the CDR sector is pretty much in the process of collapsing right now. And over the next few years, we'll probably see 2/3 of the 900 or so startups that have started in that sector go bankrupt. I think we have to conclude that the only opportunities that we have for achieving potentially scalable and cost-effective CDR is in the ocean. And it makes sense. As you said, the ocean already absorbs a massive amount of carbon. It's the biggest carbon sink in the world by far. And if we can just tweak it to absorb a little bit more, that can be potentially like a huge thing. So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. We don't have any directly active programs that we're doing in that space because we believe that other people are working on them better. But whenever we find other organizations that are doing things that we believe in, we like to support them to do them rather than doing our own programs in this space. So, but certainly something I'm very much passionate about, and I hope can see advance at the scale and urgency that it's really needed to be able to address some of them.
That's great. I'll put you in touch with some people at the Climate Restoration Alliance. They're planning a field test to do this very thing with eddies early next year. January, I think, is their target date. But I do talk about a lot of these different ideas on my video channel. The cement thing, if you can figure out how to increase the durability and lifetime of cement, most cement, it breaks apart after 3 or 4 decades. The Romans built structures in the ocean. Their cement structures are thousands of years old. They used volcanic ash They used seawater. They used different types of calcium sources, and their cement actually hardens over time. And you think of Roman structures in Europe that are still there. They're concrete structures. So we could really reduce the best way to reduce emissions from concrete and cement is to increase the longevity of it. There are some companies, I know some engineers that are working on that. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of
And
ideas. It's just, we need the people to look at them and say, well, this is worth pursuing. This isn't really worth pursuing as much.
low carbon cement options actually do have longer durability and hardness properties, particularly the ones that are looking at using, what is it called? Is it called steel ash? I forget what it is, but they're mixing other industrial byproducts into
And
it. There's a lot of really promising directions there. I completely agree.
what about clean energy? Are you staying away from that more or less, or are you looking at solar? The Chinese obviously dominate that sector, right? Wind, solar, batteries, electric cars. And with the wars, entire countries want to transition off. They're dependent on fossil fuels. So this is all good stuff for the clean energy industry. Are you looking at some technologies to improve efficiencies of solar?
Those sectors are quite mature, so we don't feel like there's a really additive role for an organization
Okay.
like ours to play. As I
Mhm.
said, we're very bullish on geologic hydrogen, and we're making a big investment in that because we think if it turns out to be true, it could be a real game changer. We're also trying to do innovations in sustainable infrastructure financing. So we have a program called Tertiary Capital that uses capital locked up in DAFs. I don't know if you know this, but right now there's, I think, 250 to $300 billion in the US alone that's locked up in DAFs, donor advised funds, that's expected to grow to possibly as high as $1 trillion just by 2030. This is money that people have put into DAFs in order to get the tax benefit of a write-off, but haven't yet actually deployed to nonprofits to actually enact change for a variety of different reasons. And so one of the things we want to do is, can we use that DAF funding to provide loan guarantees for first of a kind or nth of a kind sustainable infrastructure financing without the money ever having to leave the DAF. So that money can stay in the DAF and continue to earn its 7% a year and grow. But by providing loan guarantees and structuring like portfolio deals with relatively low failure rates, you can like use that capital to actually bring down the cost of capital for critical financing. So that's been our main play so far, where we think we have a really additive role to play. We're very bullish on market shaping in general, on bringing down the cost of capital, on using innovative new methods for financing and in general.
No, what you're saying, I'm just wondering, Joshua, our program last week, we had Zipporah Berman, who is the initiator of the Global Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and one of the people behind the recent conference in Colombia on fossil fuel transition. And we spoke with her at some length about the challenge, obviously, of financing the transition away from fossil fuels, well, for almost every country, unless they're advanced. And I'm wondering whether some of the initiatives that you've just talked about with the DAFs or otherwise might be able to be connected to those challenges as well, even though you're not working in that sector per se, but they've been trying to work, no disrespect to them, but that nobody's been able to come up with a sustainable way to help countries get off of fossil fuels without losing significant portions of their revenue. And obviously, one or two tweaks is not going to do it. But I'm just curious if there might be some synergy there.
To be honest, I mean, it's a question of scale, really, right? The scale of the kind of funds that you would need to be able to acquire to affect change at that country level is more than philanthropy is going to be able to provide in any reasonable capacity. And it's also, again, a question about like getting countries off of fossil fuels, transitioning them to investing in green energy infrastructure instead is largely not a cost problem, right? Like solar and wind are cheaper than fossil fuel alternatives on almost all places, except for maybe coal in certain like, in coal-rich countries. The cost of the financing is usually not really the biggest challenge when it comes to just like decarbonizing the energy sector. Decarbonizing heavy industry, that's a very different story. And so that's where when I'm talking about financing first of a kind
Right.
facilities, a lot of that is in those sectors where we're trying to produce zero carbon jet fuel factories, right? But nobody wants to finance a zero carbon jet fuel factory because no one's ever done it before. So the banks and things are like, well, this is
Yeah.
scary and new. I don't know if I can do that. You're going to have
No,
to pay a 20% interest rate on this loan or whatever. And that makes the project impossible.
no, I understand. Let me get back to big, bold technology, something I had never heard of until I was looking at your work in preparation for today's meeting, and that is the idea of inland sea reflooding, a project that you're working on that involves potentially in Egypt, Ethiopia, Australia, maybe a couple other places. Tell our viewers what that's all about.
Depending on your prior, this is either the most obvious thing in the world or the craziest of all the crazy ideas that we work on in my portfolio. The basic idea is, hey, currently we rely on big, huge sheets of ice sitting on land at the poles to store the excess water that we don't want in our oceans. And that capacity is declining. So where else can we store that water? Well, it turns out there are several pretty deep holes around the world, maybe about a dozen of them, that we could actually refill with ocean water, storing that water on land effectively, making new seas, and we could measurably reduce sea levels. The most promising site is this one called the Qattara Depression in Western Egypt. It's only about 50 kilometers from the Mediterranean. It used to be connected to the Mediterranean and was, in fact, a sea. So it's not only a desert, but a salt desert. It's one of the hottest and most barren places on the entire Earth. With relatively little effort, we could actually refill it and turn it into a sea again. Egypt actually wants to do this. They've wanted to do this for decades, but they haven't been able to get the sufficient financing terms to be able to do it. And they want to do it not because it'll reduce sea level. They want to do it because it'll generate massive amounts of hydroelectric power, and it will create an entirely new vacation destination in Western Egypt. And it will create potentially a number of other new industries. I mean, in fact, these are projects, most of the projects we scoped in that report are projects that would pay for themselves multiple times over just in the local benefits alone. Just in the production of hydroelectric power and other high value local benefits. And then when you start to calculate the implications they could have, I mean, even reducing sea level rise by 2 centimeters, that's trillions saved in global impacts over the next 60 to 80 years. It's massive. The potential is real. It's maybe a little bit crazy, but the potential is real. We've recently taken that project into the next phase, which we call our build phase. We have a fantastic program lead named Charlotte Love, who's driving that program forward. We're doing the detailed regional climate modeling that's necessary to really understand how the local regional climate changes with the introduction of these new seas and what we could expect. We're hoping that to be able to make the case to the World Bank that projects like this deserve highly preferential financing terms because they're basically the most high value adaptation actions we could take in the entire world. I mean, the ROI in terms of the savings to the globe of being able to, I mean, sea level is the most pernicious problem with climate change, right? There is nothing you can do about sea level rise. The sea levels rise, and that's it. We're talking tens to hundreds of millions of people displaced. We're talking saltwater inundation, intrusion into groundwater resources, disrupting agriculture, disrupting people's water supplies. And there's nothing we can do about it. Well, it turns out maybe there's one thing we can do about it. We can make new seas. That's about it. I'd much rather us stop the seas from rising in the first place by preventing the glaciers from further deteriorating and collapsing. But it's good to have a backup plan, I'd say.
Paul.
Yeah, I mean, cooling the planet will reduce the rise of sea levels.
It really won't because
There's a time lag.
it's already
Yep.
in the ocean, and those warmer oceans are really what's driving the destabilization of these key ice sheets. It'll have some effect, of course. It's not going to stop sea level rise at the level that we would need it to just from atmospheric cooling.
New Orleans was in the news just in the last few days because some scientists in a recent paper are saying we need to start evacuating. And I think the population has decreased there since Katrina. About a month ago, there was a very good paper that came out that was arguing that existing climate models, they're getting sea level rise wrong because of the geoid models that they use. They don't have enough measurements. When they ground truth it with measurements, especially in the southern hemisphere, they find that average sea level is actually quite a bit higher than we account for in the models. So yeah, it's a huge issue, of course. Of course, if the AMOC does slow down significantly, even stop, sea level rise on the eastern seaboard of the US will be probably over a meter. And that would happen very, very quickly.
And add it potentially up to a meter. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, in addition. And then, of course, if you get a superstorm like Katrina 2.0 or whatever, it must be discouraging for many scientists and engineers in the US. Extremely discouraging, especially if they work in government and they've lost their jobs, especially if you're a climate scientist and so on. In many other countries, they're doing more and more research and getting, more information on, like I'm talking about Europe. Have to talk about China. I mean, this is part of the need for the philanthropy as you mentioned already, but maybe can you enlarge on that a little bit? Would you be doing as much, do you think, if you still had, say, a Biden or Obama government, or are you being driven to do more and get more funding and more money and more impact because of the political situation at the present?
It's a good question. I mean, I think most of the things that we work on are, by definition, are beyond the edge of what governments are willing to fund, right? We try to really look for things where things need to be de-risked with philanthropic capital so that governments can then come and take them up and scale them. That's certainly true in the field of stabilization, climate stabilization stuff we're talking about here. But even in other fields, when we talk about some of this frontier mitigation work that we're doing, definitely the way that the Trump administration pulled grants and funding for various low carbon cement plants that were being built, leading to complete bankruptcies of some really promising companies. That was definitely a big part of our calculation in
Okay.
going into that cement space. This stuff like geologic hydrogen has actually been a little bit popular with this administration. So they
Um,
like geothermal and geohydrogen because it requires drilling and drilling is good.
Right, using technologies that we already have for a different purpose, yeah. Can we talk a little bit about the AI and climate? You have a strong background in AI clearly, and we talk about it being a double-edged sword. I mean, it's starting to be used more to get better weather forecasts, and it's also being used to improve climate modeling and so on. But how extensive is that? And then what happens when there's so much misinformation and deep fakes and stuff, and other AIs pick up on that, right? So isn't there a risk of like an explosion of fake stuff with AI? And AI can generate all these fake stories and fake images. We're seeing lots of misinformation in wartime, right? Like we're not getting the full picture, because information is just not made available, in wartime. So there's propaganda is ripe whenever there's wars. And we're seeing
Yeah.
that. When people see a digital image and they don't know if it's real or fake, how do we live in this type of world? How does civilization maintain itself when you can't believe anything you digitally that you see or hear? And this is when we get artificial general intelligence, which looks like it's approaching soon probably, how does it affect us, how we deal with things, and how does it affect how we deal with climate change, for example?
Going with the simple ones here, Paul. I appreciate it. I mean, the answer I can answer like reasonably answer the first question about sort of dis and misinformation and the challenges of the information environment, which is we've always fought the war against misinformation and disinformation in the climate space, and it's been one where we've had to fight it in escalating means. There's no doubt that AI accelerates that, but AI also provides us with tools to be able to improve the way we combat it. And so, unfortunately, my answer, and I don't know if this is a hot take or not, is that it's a bit of an arms race between the people that want to flood the zone with mis and disinformation and distract people, and the people that actually want to provide high quality information and combat that disinformation. And so, I think that let's call them the good actors here in this situation need to ourselves become comfortable and figure out how to invest in and be able to use those tools to be able to combat that disinformation. And of course, this all gets amplified as well in social networks where things can like scale and distribute very rapidly and sometimes get delivered to journalists with very little context. We live in a world where like tweets can literally get read on air on news shows. It is insane. So I don't disagree that it's a problem. It's definitely a problem for the climate community. It's a problem for a functioning society for sure. And unfortunately, I think the only real answer is in developing better tools to be able to combat it, identify it, mark it, flag it, take it down, whatever the different approaches are. I was in the same office at DARPA where we worked on a lot of that combating disinformation technology. And so I've seen a lot of that stuff in parts. DARPA's been a leader in that field for many decades. And so I'm reasonably optimistic, I guess as optimistic as I am about anything.
Yeah, I did some contracts with DARPA when I was working for Rockwell International years ago. I was working on laser physics stuff. So we did lots of work with DARPA, and it was working on laser switching, all optical switching. I have taken many particle physics courses and stuff, so I know where you're coming from with some of your research.
You have the challenge with misinformation when it's coming from the government that's supposed to be combating the misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, as I mentioned at the very beginning, this channel is very much a proponent, not that I want to speak for anybody else, but of aggressive research and potentially deployment of solar radiation management. I call it direct climate cooling, whether it's stratospheric aerosol injection, marine cloud brightening, other techniques. But as I understand, that's not something you're directly focusing on. You're looking at other means of intervening in the Arctic, the Antarctic, on sea level rise. Could you just explain what the thinking of Renaissance is and what your general assessment of the SRM field is these days?
I mean, again, it comes back to where we are additive and have comparative advantage. SRM and particularly SAI, which I think is probably the only near-term,
Right.
like viable, scalable SRM solution, global SRM solution. There are already quite a few pretty good orgs that are working on that from the governance side, from the science side, from the technology communication side of things. And so we didn't see it as necessary. We work really closely and try to support some of those organizations, like Reflective, for instance, which is doing great work on trying to build the fundamental knowledge base that's necessary to be able to make effective decisions on SAI. But we didn't think it was necessary to build any of that stuff ourselves. I think that the status of the SRM field is an interesting question. We are in a very, very interesting moment where we have a very, very well-funded startup called Stardust that I'm sure you guys are familiar with that claims to have a ready to go, ready to sell, ready to deploy SAI solution within the next 3 to 5 years. We're still waiting for them to transparently publish their science, which they're promising to do any day now, any week now. They started publishing a few different lightweight things in the last couple of months, which is a good sign. Unfortunately, whatever probability you put on whether or not they're right or not, and they really do have a scalable solution, whether it's 1% or 5% or 50%, I think it's something we need to take pretty damn seriously because we are not ready for a well-funded company with a profit motive, with investors to please, being out there hiring lobbyists all over the world, trying to sell an SAI solution. We don't have the attribution systems ready to go. We don't have the international collaborations. I'm not even talking about actual multilateral governance here, but at least international collaborations. We need to have systems in place before we scale this kind of thing. I mean, the first time you deploy SAI at any sort of global scale, there's going to be a drought somewhere in Vietnam or wherever it is. And Vietnam's going to say, that was caused by your SAI deployment, and I'm now going to sue the company and every country that has participated in this and funded it. If we don't have systems in place, if we don't have super high quality, high fidelity attribution systems, which will never be perfect, which will never be able to fully address the litigation risk and all this stuff. So we're also going to have funds in place. We're also going to have like a large scale, like global coordinated fund to be able to, and a system for actually like evaluating these claims that countries will make and negotiating payments if it is determined that there is some probability that, say, an SAI deployment did in fact contribute to the severity of drought in a particular country. We need these systems in place, ideally before we start deploying. So, geez, this is the thing that keeps me up about the SRM community right now is a lot of the community is not really taking Stardust seriously. And I can understand that because they have not been transparent. And that's very, very frustrating. But I think that's the biggest thing that's happening and that we're not sufficiently taking seriously enough is that possibility.
I couldn't agree with you more. We just had a week or two ago, Janos Pastor, who was the consultant to Stardust after an illustrious career spent, at Carnegie and other places. And I'll be going to a conference at the University of Chicago where the CEO of Stardust, amongst other people, will be speaking.
I'll be there, yeah.
Because I'm hoping we can invite him to the CEO to come on to Climate Emergency Forum, and maybe you can help us compose the questions.
Yanai is fantastic. I'm sure he'd be happy to come on. I consider Yanai a friend at this point. We've talked a lot. He's a really good, really smart person, obviously. He really is genuinely trying to do something good here, right? This is not some evil masterminds that live inside of a volcano that decided to invent an SAI solution to take over the world. They believe what they're doing is absolutely good. And frankly, I don't want them to fail, right? Like, I want them to succeed, to be honest. I just don't think that success means doing a deployment in 3 years with 1 or 2 countries as the buyer, because I don't think that's a stable long-term solution. I think that there will be lawsuits, there will be collapse, and then we'll have 10 years where everybody will be scared to even touch this stuff with a 10-foot pole. And that's not good for the world. It's not good for this field, and it's not good for Stardust, and it's not good for their investors. So why don't do it? Don't do it. Like, wait.
From my knowledge of SRM, the kind of attribution studies and governance is not, I mean, they are, I don't know if it's benign neglect or focusing on physical research, but maybe you ought to reconsider and fund some efforts to begin to build that dimension of the sector, or at least work with your counterparts who fund it to move that forward, because that's been my own observation. That needs to happen, and it doesn't appear to be happening, unfortunately. Lots of research, every 3 days there's another paper about if you put SAI at this latitude and it'll affect this crop in Africa by this much, hundreds and hundreds of papers like that. But who's looking at these bigger picture questions?
We're in the process as part of our CEF, which, by the way, we are in the process of rebranding and launching so that there will no longer be confusion relatively soon. But we're in the process, we're preparing for a big summit, the Global Risk and Stabilization Summit, we're going to be hosting in Iceland in October. And we're also producing a synthesis report in the field of climate stabilization that will cover the wide range of issues, including questions of governance structures and et cetera, not just for solar geoengineering. We look at the field of stabilization very broadly, Arctic cooling, stabilizing the Arctic. I mean, that's my number one priority. I mean, you can't spend more than 5 minutes looking at the Arctic without realizing that it's got to be the number one priority of the climate community and society. Just stop the destabilization that's happening there. People in the Arctic have a saying. They say what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. And I promise you, the climate change that's happening in the Arctic is not going to stay there very much longer.
The original saying is what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. Is not like Las Vegas. I coined that phrase on a news station about a decade ago. That was the first time it was used, I think. I think I can claim that it was my original saying. The ultimate stabilization, though, whether SRM is deployed or not, it's arguable that it would be reducing CO2 levels back to where we were, like 350 or 300 parts per million. Humans thrived with those levels. It never went above those levels. So that would be the ultimate stabilization. Have a look at what the Climate Restoration Alliance is arguing, because they have a plan where they say that they can achieve this withdrawing, and it's using the irons in eddies. So, it's still early stages. They haven't had field trials yet, but this is, in my view, this is the most promising technology that I think if we can get this to work. Let's say suddenly somebody went and started seeding eddies and drawing down CO2. What would the world see? Well, the CO2 rise wouldn't be 3 ppm per year. It would start reducing over time and then stabilize and then start going down if this technique became successful. So
the problem is we got to remove trillions of tons of
yes,
CO2 from the atmosphere. And there's no way that just one possible solution can scale to trillions of tons. CDR is going to require multiple different approaches and is eventually almost certainly going to require direct air capture. Hopefully, we can come up with some open system-based solutions that we can do now, while direct air capture slowly becomes cheaper and cheaper and cheaper until it's finally actually sustainable. But yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, when we talk about the solution space for any given risk, it always stops out with stop emitting so much damn carbon and scale up efforts to remove it from the atmosphere. And then also, by the way, we need to do X, Y, and Z and Q, or at least we need to research these things to figure out if they're scalable and deployable, so that we can buy us enough time for that mitigation and removal to actually be able to kick in. So I couldn't agree with you more.
Well, let me just wrap it up with one last question. I've put your 2035 hat on, and we've invited you back. Hopefully, we're all able to be back in 10 years. What's a best case for where we might be?
I think the best case scenario for me, probably being honest and expressing my just opinion here, is that governments in the multilateral community have now fully accepted the fact that there is no safe and equitable climate transition at this point without taking very, very seriously a number of different options for stabilizing key Earth systems. That almost certainly means some form of solar geoengineering in order to reduce the severity and length of overshoot, but it also means a number of other solutions, particularly at the interface of the ocean and the cryosphere, where SAI by itself simply won't solve the problems. We're taking those things very seriously within a decade. The governments are putting in the billions a year in research instead of the tens of millions that philanthropy are currently putting in now, in order to really figure out whether these things are scalable and safe, and starting to do the kinds of medium scale testing needed to deploy them. And I'd say within 10 years, I'm hoping that some form of global solar geoengineering, whether that's a form of SAI or something else we haven't figured out yet that's better, is at minimum doing the kinds of scalable, deployable infrastructure and medium scale experiments necessary to get ready for deployment. Because I think within 10 years, we're going to need it, is my personal expectation. I hope we take this stuff seriously. I hope we get to that point. And I hope that that realization and that movement towards these things, and I believe this to be true, I don't just hope this, I don't think that's going to reduce the world's or our politicians or our institutions' incentives for reducing emissions or accelerating CDR. I think, in fact, the evidence, which is mixed, what shows is that, in fact, doing those things and accepting that we have to take these extraordinary measures actually increases people's desire because they're like, holy crap, we got to stop burning coal so we can stop doing this crazy crap in the stratosphere.
Exactly. Well, that's I think, combination of inspiring and realistic decade look. We hope you'll come back before a decade and speak with us again. This has been remarkable.
Absolutely.
I know I speak for Paul. Really important, unbelievably important work you're doing. I want you to know that this Climate Emergency Forum is completely supportive of the Climate Emergencies Forum and whatever else you might call it in the future. You've got a friend, you've got a supporter here. Please, let your folks know about what we can provide, whether someone wants to write an article for our website or come on the program or whatever. We've got to work together, promoting this stuff, sharing ideas, and supporting each other. The most important venture and imaginable for mankind. And you're right in the heart of it. So thanks so much, Joshua. We so appreciate your time with us today.
Awesome. Same here. I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
And after that remarkable conversation with Joshua Elliott, we'll go to our Climate 3, three of the bigger stories of this past week on climate change. Many of you, maybe all of you, have been reading about, maybe with a little bit of trepidation, the hantavirus. Well, hantaviruses in Argentina have almost doubled in the past year, with the country now recording 32 deaths in the last year, the highest. Many experts are saying that the increase in hantavirus is directly due or indirectly due to the effects of climate change. And since we're just emerging to see the effects of climate change, I think, as with many diseases, we may have a grim future unless we're able to address climate change and address bacterial and other viral diseases. Story number 2 was as much about the headline of a story that I saw a day or two ago. And here's the headline. We did a program recently on the Super El Nino. Well, this story in a South Asian journal headlines as follows: Southeast Asia warned of Godzilla El Nino. It's not funny, but it is funny. A whiplash threatening drought, floods, and haze. So let's hope that, even though the latest that I read was that the odds are as much as 82% likely that we'll have, I guess we can call it a Godzilla El Nino. It's something we should all be prepared for if we have travel plans, if we live in places with high heat. The likelihood of having extreme year and a half worth of weather is something not to be ignored. The third story, I was really struck in reading the New York Times the other day that one of the major articles by a contributor, an outside contributor, basically was making the argument that the Democratic Party in the United States should essentially ignore climate change. That if they want to get elected, just put it aside, don't talk about it, talk about housing, talk about the environment, but don't talk about climate change, because they say it's become so polarized. And of course, it's polarized because the opponents have made it polarized. But I thought that was quite shocking. It's certainly reasonable to make a case like that. But for a paper like the New York Times to promote an article that's basically saying, forget about climate change, or at least forget about talking about it, I think is a sad indicator of where we are today. So today's sort of three versions, the hantavirus, the Godzilla El Nino, and forget about climate change, just at the time that a Godzilla El Nino is coming, shows the kind of craziness that we all have to deal with right now, as best as we can. And I hope you, the viewer, are keeping your sanity as much as you can. I know I am absolutely failing at keeping my sanity. I'm also really pleased to announce that we have started adding to our website some of our recent videos as podcasts. You will find them easily if you go to our website and you look at the menu, and you'll see podcasts, and you will be able to use, in many cases, your favorite channel. I think we have 5 different channels that broadcast our podcasts. We encourage you to do that. We encourage you to share them with your friends, your family, and your neighbors. So with that, last moment and last comment. As always, we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much. Bye.